Okay, let's start the afternoon session. So we begin with the presentation from Professor Raymond Knopp on media tool for experimentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Um, so it's very nice being here. It's always very nice to come to Greece. It's one of my favorite places to go. I'm sorry I had to skip some of the lectures because when I told my family that I was coming to Greece, they obviously said you're taking us with you, and I have children, so it's very I, I have to be diplomatic. Um, so I think this is going to be one of the first talks that's actually down in the lower layers. I'm going to talk about software-defined radio tools for experimentation. This is really an overview of the use. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a mistake here. An overview of the use of natural instruments USRPs and some emerging ORAN radio units. It's actually a very fresh presentation, so you're sort of pinpricks for me here. I've never talked about this subject in this kind of a format. And this is actually one of the first presentations I prepared really for the Slices Initiative. So first of all, who I am Department of Communication Systems at EURECOM. EURECOM, and I'm actually also president of the Open Interface Software Alliance, which is one of the tools that Seth mentioned yesterday. I'm a long-time software-defined radio and radio access network computer. I've been working in software-defined radio for, I would say, 25 years at this point. From the very, very, very beginning of software-defined radio. And I work at an institute called EURECOM, which is in the south of France, in a region that is not too different from the region that we're in today. It's also on the Mediterranean, with very, very similar scenery, although a little bit different. And I think, tomorrow you'll also hear talk from one of the other institutes right next to ours in India. And together we form what we're calling the Social and People Use and Aid. Here, so we're located in the south of the district. So here's an outline of my talk this afternoon. I will give some high-level descriptions of software-defined radios, in particular when they're used as 3GPP radio units. So we're talking about radio units primarily today for implementing 5G. So I'll talk about fronthaul systems and protocols and some of the associated challenges that we have from in an experimental community with respect to the actual radio capability. I'll also go over very quickly here at the beginning some of the capabilities of off-the-shelf USRPs, which I'll explain to those who don't know what they are. I'll look at what's known as the USRP hardware driver on how you do actual real-time interfacing for something as complicated as 5G. And I will give an example of a different protocol, the eSecret protocol, and how it's used in another device that you can buy off the shelf, not quite as popular as USRPs, and I think you'll see why. And then finally, I'll talk about transitioning software radios like open air interface. The same could be said of other software radios towards what's very, very modern, the ORAN open fronthaul interface. We've started using some of these devices now in our lab, and from my talk you will see how different this is from the perspective of, say, a USRP. So first, a little bit about software-defined radio. The canonical software-defined radio is the National Instruments USRP, which stands for Universal Software Radio Protocol. Just out of interest here, how many people in the room have used a USRP? Not so much. Not so bad. How many people have programmed the USRP API? A couple of people. That's good. What I'll talk about a little bit here is that aspect and how you make that evolve. Because when it comes to experimentation, sometimes you're going to be confronted with radios that you don't necessarily have the driver for, which is not the case for your USRP. But if you want to build a software radio on top of the USRP, you have to be able to use the underlying. So for me, this is really the basic research tool for experimentation with radio access network processing protocol. There are others. There are devices like LateRF or Lime SDR. And again, at the very beginning of our activity in software radio connection, we built our own SDR at the time when there weren't USRPs. But at one point, we transitioned to USRPs because groups like ours, we have to divide our time between building hardware and writing device drivers and actually writing the radio protocols. So when the USRPs came around and was mature enough to implement something like 4G at the time, that was a natural transition point to start using USRPs exclusively. And I think that's the case for a lot of labs, at least here at USRP protocols at the case. USRP becomes the de facto device. Now, the reason it is because it provides a real-time interconnection of a PC-based application with a radio frequency front end. That's a marvelous thing. And there's a nice community around it to keep the software alive. Now, what's interesting about the USRP, at least the most recent ones, if anybody's used it, like using like all 30 years, there are many commonalities between the actual hardware inside a USRP with current commercial radio units. The heart of an ORAN radio unit is not radically different from a USRP M310 or X4 and X14. It's essentially the same thing under the hood. But there are other things in a commercial radio unit that make it a commercial radio unit. I'll try and detail some of those things. I mean, they have similar RF chipsets, so the high-end USRPs that I just mentioned, and they also have fairly high-end FPGA logic that use so-called FPGA system on chip. And for the great majority of them, they use the LB and Zinc inside, just like an USRP expert. But there are also many differences with respect to the cellular industry radio units. USRP has a research focus. It's why it's so important for communities that do experimental work. But it does not have built-in power circuits that gives access actually to wideband tuning. So there's a trade-off when using USRP. You have very wideband access. You can work at any parts of the spectrum up until 6 gigahertz. But you don't have the power to actually deploy this in an operational setting. Now, there are different also so-called front-haul protocols, which I'll describe. The USRP uses something called UHD, or the USRP hardware driver, which, if you like, in the context of something like ORAN, is the equivalent of the front-haul protocol. In fact, it's not equivalent. It is a front-haul protocol, but it's specified by the community around the USRP. Now, to make a USRP actually look like a commercial radio unit, you need to either replace UHD completely, or you need to make a software wrapper which uses UHD under the hood. But this is something that's actually quite inefficient. A few years ago, when we were playing around with so-called split RAN interfaces, the split 7 picture, we'll see a little bit later, we built a little radio unit using USRP 3 and an embedded PC, an upboard. And on the upboard, we programmed the front-haul protocol to look a lot like what you have in an ORAN radio unit today. But there was UHD under the hood. We emulated the radio unit with UHD. That's really the main difference. So here I've listed the 5G capable USRPs. The lowest level USRP, the B210, which has a USB 3 interface, you could actually do, and we do in the OAI community, a lot of people use this for a 40 megahertz bandwidth 5G new radios. The only downside is that it's single antenna. For 40 megahertz. It's actually very difficult to do MIMO above 10 megahertz bandwidth. on this device. You can do MIMO with 10 megahertz, but 10 megahertz is a very, very difficult channel in 5G. You'll find very few terminals that will operate with 10 megahertz today. It will come, but today no. And below 10 megahertz, forget it completely. 5G really starts at 20 megahertz and above. And MIMO, anybody that's used a VP10, even on 20 megahertz on a VP10, technically it's feasible, but you have to do some tricks to make that happen. So for me, this is really capable only for single antenna, which is fine for some people concept. But strictly speaking, if you want to go 5G, it's not the thing I would choose. The minimal for me is really the X300 device, which is one of the classical USRPs also, which has either a 1 or 2 times 10 gigabit Ethernet or a PCI Express frontal interfaces. So you can do it either Ethernet or PCI Express. And you can go up to 80 megahertz bandwidth 2x2. So that's a much more serious 5G device. And it's actually an old USRP. It's not one of the network series USRP. The most common ones for doing 5G are the N300 or N310, because these allow, again, with a 2 times 10 gigabit frontal interface, up to 100 megahertz 2x2 MIMO. So that's the maximal sub 6 gigahertz channel bandwidth in 5G. You could actually also do 60 megahertz bandwidth 2x2 MIMO without what I would call RF impairments. If you want to do the full bandwidth on this, you actually suffer a little bit. There are problems on the uplinks of these devices, but that's really for expert use. They are still usable up to the full bandwidth. The next series up to 320 and 321 are also 2 times 10 gigabit, but they also have 40 gigabit frontal. And on these, you can do up to 100 megahertz 2x2 without any impairments whatsoever, and up to 200 megahertz with some RF impairments. The Rolls-Royce now is this X410, and we have one of them now at EURECOM that we're working with. This can have up to 100 gigahertz frontal. And you can have 4x4 MIMO with up to 400 megahertz in this device. So this is really the state-of-the-art device, and very equivalent in terms of what, if you were to buy from Mavenir a 4x4 O-RAN radio unit, it would essentially be this inside. So it's an expensive device, but it is really the best. So the question is, why go beyond the UHD support for experimentation? And that's what I'm going to talk about. Often we need to build custom solutions for experimentation. So I think we heard talk from Managosan Power. We have many nice outdoor facilities. Here, you also have an outdoor facility. We have an outdoor facility. If you want to build something like that around the USRP, you actually have to find some custom RF circuits that you interface with the USRP. That starts to become more complicated. You need additional real-time interfaces to control these external circuits. You need to calibrate combined solutions, and you need sometimes even field deployable outdoor solutions, which means you have to worry about outdoor conditions and rain and things like that. Which means you have to take your USRP, you have to put it in the casing, you have to put additional RF circuits inside the casing or separately. So there's all kinds of extra mechanical work and electrical work and electronics work that needs to get done. So this takes a lot of time and effort. What's interesting today, I mean, 5, 6 years ago, that's really all you could do. And if you look at some of the platforms in the United States, and our first platform that we had at EURECOM, we did that. But the investment is huge. Today, there are off-the-shelf solutions that exist. But in that case, you leave the world with the USRP. And you have to look at other types of frontal solutions, and I will try and explain differences. So all-in-one radio units that combine the equivalent of the USRP N300 or X410 with power circuits They do exist. And you know, for instance, today it is possible for labs to buy O-RAN radio units. You have to be a little bit nice to the companies because they don't really want to sell this to experimental labs, but it is possible to get them. There are some labs that are selling C3 radio units, and one French company, AW2S, that sells two C3 radio units. And these are ones that we're trying to promote a little bit because they work very, very well, and they're very reasonably priced. Now, they combine a UHD-like interface with high power and field deployable RF solutions. That's very good for the experimental platform activities. Now, the one major limitation is that they're usually limited to certain bands. But ultimately, that's not a major limitation because if you want to have an experimental network that you deploy outdoors, you have to ask your local regulator anyways for the right to transmit. If you want to do everything according to the books, you have to ask for permission to transmit in a particular band. Almost surely you would be able to buy a radio unit that works in the band that you will get permission to use. But sometimes they require more complex synchronization and management protocols in order to function. Not always, but sometimes this is, for instance, precision time protocols or management using network. And you'll see some of these things in so we talked a little bit more about 3GPP radio units. What is in a typical radio unit? You have a multi-channel RF front end, amplification, power and low noise application, up and down conversion, A to B, B to A conversion. You have digital processing for certain types of RF impairments, linearization in the case of a high power amplifier. And for OFDM targeted frequency domain devices, you might even have extra Fourier transforms and cyclic prefix handling according to the O-RAN open frontal 7.2 protocol. So that this is what you would have in terms of digital processing. You most definitely have some form of real-time interfacing with baseband processing, compression, decompression in some cases, a control plane protocol. So UHD has a control plane protocol under the hood. Some devices use ETSI-ORI. I don't know if you'll see that in a second. And more recently, the O-RAN frontal interface control plane. These are all examples of control plane protocol. There is some form of packetization and transport. So for me, packetization, what it means is a radio protocol. So you need some way of streaming the radio signals across a network. So that could be UHD streamer in the case of UHD, the O-RAN user plane frontal protocol, or something proprietary over EC3 or C3. That's where these things diverge. The transport is usually over some standard bus protocol. It could be USB 3, as you saw in the USRP examples, or USB-C coming. PCI Express is very common also. And also transport over Ethernet. So the EC3 or C3 uses some form of Ethernet. C3 is not strictly speaking Ethernet, but almost. Or you would see in some radio units a combination of both, where you have a PCI Express so that the host can dialogue with the radio unit, and ultimately there's a network interconnection with the other end of the system. That's very common with EC3 and C3. Management protocols. Anybody that's used the USRP, it's very simple. And you have an SSH access to the USRP, so you can log into the USRP and configure it, update the firmware. So those very simple management via telnet or SSH. That's the case of a USRP or the AW2S units. Or you can have a full management system via network. So the modern radio units are really becoming networking devices like a Cisco switch or a Juniper switch that use network. O-RAN adopts network for all of the network elements, including the radio unit. So that's really diverging from the experimental units that we all use in the lab. And very often now you will find synchronization protocols and methods for synchronizing different units, synchronizing them through GPS or some other atomic. And so these are characteristics of what I would call a modern radio unit. Let me skip that. We can look at that afterwards. So I'm not being very efficient with time here. We look more closely at front haul systems and protocols. What is really front haul? For me, at least, you see different definitions for this. It's the transport of radio signals over a network. This is quite an important concept for the modern system. It took a long time in coming, but it's here now, and with O-RAN, it's here very, very heavily. Now, why would you want to do this, transport radio over a network? There are several reasons, at least the basic reason. First of all, to allow distance between the baseband processing and the antenna itself. Traditionally, this was on the order of tens of meters, connecting the roof of the top of a cell tower to the bottom. They would use the secret protocol there. But as we go towards 5G, we're talking about 20-kilometer ranges. We actually have a networking protocol of essentially over 10 kilometers between the radio unit and the network that's processing it. Another important reason is to allow for statistical multiplexing of multiple radio sites that share a common fiber link. In 5G, the radios are all over the place, and if you want to have centralized processing, you're going to have to share the fiber in some way or another. It'll be multi-tier, but at one point in the network, you're going to be sharing multiple radio sites. The front-haul protocols allow you to do efficient statistical multiplexing on those fiber links, especially on the uplink. That's why a lot of these people are doing this. And also potentially to share the processing between radio units and baseband units. So in this picture, you basically see that if you have a central processing location, it might be serving long distance links for certain radio units. And it might be connected to another baseband unit that is much closer to the actual antenna, depending on the amount of traffic that these different radio units are servicing in the network. But the front haul is really that network between the radio and the rest of the processing. Now, there are different types. Everybody's excited now about digital front haul, where you're really packetizing digitized signals at some point in your transmission. But actually, I think there are actually a lot of analog front haul systems out there. Because radio over fiber is actually used by some equipment vendors, and I think in particular Huawei. I'm not sure about that. Maybe they do several things. Where you actually modulate the RF signal or an intermediate frequency signal on an optical carrier. And you don't actually leave the analog domain. The RF analog signals are modulated onto an optical carrier and transported over long distances before they're converted. This can be efficient, maybe more efficient in terms of cost or latency, but the underlying problem is that it will be a proprietary system. It will be Huawei system. It will be Nokia system. It will be vendor X system. Digital can allow you to reuse standard Ethernet equipment for the radio. And it could be more flexible than the analog solution to be able to reuse existing fiber infrastructure like the infrastructure that's there for fiber to the home could very well be used also for people. If you need that. And I think some operators are looking at that. In terms of types, the digital front haul protocols, you can have non-Ethernet based or non-strictly speaking Ethernet based. So C3 is that. It's a partial non-PGP specification, and it has vendor-specific extensions. So it's not meant to be an interoperable thing, and it's really defined for point-to-point between the radio and the baseband. So it is not a switched networking protocol, really pointed. Now, the reason it's popular is there are good implementations in FPGA. In particular, the one from AMD Xilinx is very common. And it's usually coupled with PCI Express on the baseband unit side. Anybody use Microsoft? You've heard of Microsoft, I'm pretty sure. If you buy their commercial product with an AWS radio unit, they use C2. Because they want to have a point-to-point link with a card that they stick in a PC that runs with their software. They don't want to have to worry about Ethernet. It's a very common thing because of the good implementation in an FTP. And you have to buy an extra card. So then there's nothing. Ethernet based or really EC3 can be either raw or UDP based transport. It's also a partial non-3GPP specification with vendor specific extension. So it's not a complete specification. The interesting thing about EC3, it can be switched. For EC3, the packetization of the transports can be as simple as just a fixed rate time domain IP sampling, just like the USRP. Or it could also be much more complex variable rate frequency domain signals, which is the case of OEM. You can have different types of EC3 solutions. So here, this is the typical C3 scenario where you have potentially a long distance link between the radio unit, which in the context of C3 they call the radio equipment, the RE. It's very confusing with respect to TGP. RE is the resource element in TGP, which is connected to a line card inside a processing unit. That line card is called the REC, radio equipment center, which is a central processing location, which typically has a PCI Express link with the or ENOD if it's 4G. C3 is typically a 4G technology, but some companies like Microsoft use it for 5G. EC3, and here you can see a picture of the specification, and you can see why it is what it is. Was developed by Ericsson, Huawei, NEC, and Knopp. They came up with this document. Like, this is EC3. They probably actually use it in their equipment, but if you look carefully, you'll see lots of things vendor specific, this and that. So it's very unlikely that you would take a piece of radio unit with EC3 developed by Ericsson and connect it to radio equipment center controller by Huawei. That's very unlikely. It might have worked in one technology show just to show that it's possible, but in the field, that's not going to happen, and that's done by the vendor. Now, what's interesting is that what they did here is they meant to evolve the point-to-point protocol of C3 into a network somehow. So from a network architecture, this is an interesting thing. It does not specify, but it actually implies some form of control and management and some form of synchronization. They don't do the specification. And it's clearly not meant to ensure any, as I said, any type of interoperability between vendors because of the vendor specific vendor. So this is really the EC3/C3 ecosystem what it looks like. You can see the yellow box here is the EC3 radio equipment control, or the central location. The green is the actual radio equipment. They talk about 3 different service access points. A user plane, that's where we actually send the radio signals, a synchronization plane, and a control and management plane. And you can see underneath, the user plane is EC3 specific. So that's what that document specifies. The other 2, they say use stand for. Now, underneath, you can see basically the picture. Here, you would have a long distance EC3 link, which would be connected to either a standard network interface part or what I would call a smart network interface. That's actually a revolution there, because you don't need that line card, which is manufactured by whoever is manufacturing the radio unit. You can use a standard Intel NIC with EC3 for the most part, and that's what happens in ORAN. But there are some vendors like AMD Xilinx that make what are known as smart NICs. So what's the difference between a standard and a smart NIC? And the packet processing for EC3 can be done in software. Okay? For instance, in Open Interface, we do this. I'll show you an example. We do this in ORAN. The open fronthaul interface is that. It's all of the packet processing that is transported over EC3. And then in this case, if it's done in software, a standard network interface part is sufficient. But ultimately, this requires using CPU cores to handle the input and output from the network interface card and do the parsing of the protocol fields. So everything is on uh, the main CPU cores. That's why Intel likes this so much, because that encourages you to buy machines with many cores. You can dedicate some of them to the input output, and everybody's happy. Question is the cost of the now, to be efficient, the various data plane acceleration techniques, because it's done in software, are needed. You most definitely, for certain packet processing, have to use single instruction multiple data. If you look carefully in the Intel implementation of ORAN, you will see that. According to Intel, you have to use DPPK. So that's the Intel solution inside of ORAN. That's a necessity today. To ensure zero copy between the network interface card and the application. The memory that's going from the network to the application should not have to go through many copies of the kernel and whatever. In my opinion, there are also real recent Linux kernel extensions which minimize the copy. And that you can exploit in some of these. And avoid to use something like the PDK. But these are especially needed for something as complicated as the ORAN split settings. Now, and because of this complication, you need all of these fancy techniques to run on in software. These smart NICs are emerging. So there is one from AMD environments called the T110. Okay, and here EC3 and even the ORAN frontal interface packet parsing are completely offloaded to FPGA. And there are direct memory access transfers over PCI Express to provide the PDUs for the baseband processing. So all of this packet processing that's done in software is offloaded to a hardware accelerator. You will see more of these things in time. And if vendors actually adopt solutions on top of something like ORAN, they will be forced to use these things for cost and/or power consumption. Not necessarily the design solution, but something equivalent. Another thing that you see in these radio units are the necessity of certain specific protocols like the HTTP. That is not to be avoided. Synchronization protocols and management protocols. So DHCP is often a requirement. The synchronization plane is typically something like Precision Time Protocol version 2 or synchronous Ethernet. Both of them are possible. You usually need a grandmaster functionality to be co-located with your central processing nodes. This is not something all of us have in our lives. We've invested recently at EURECOM because we want to play around with these things, but we need this kind of thing. Now, management is usually open except in ORAN, but typically based today on NetConf and Yang. I'll give you examples of that. But this is another way of looking at the current C3, EC3 networking solution. And I think if we were to project ourselves a few years in the future, should ORAN actually happen in operator networks, or whether people actually use EC3 in an Ericsson network, it would look something like this. You have a PTP grandmaster in the middle. You have pools of radio elements and pools of controller elements, and a transport network. So that would be the very large optical transport network in the metropolitan network, for instance. Now, you might have some legacy units, so those green ones on the bottom, those are actually would be 4G base stations that are connected to this. So what did they do inside of the C3, EC3 community? They developed what are known as interworking functions so that you can connect C3 radio units to an EC3 network. So ultimately what this means is some of these yellow things one day could be ORAN compliant radio units, or they could be implementing an Ericsson version of something or other. And the green ones are legacy 4G units. And this could all interwork at one point. That could happen. They've done this on purpose so that it should happen. Not for sure that it's going to happen, but it is. Another thing that's important in this world is the notion of the functional split. So EC3 in itself does not say what data has to be transported by the network. It's just radio data. So what that opens the door to is actually transporting something a little bit higher up in the protocol stack, which is still radio data, but not necessarily the signals that go directly to the radio unit data converters, data being degraded. And this really, this notion of a functional split was actually adopted in this ORAN open frontal interface. From my perspective, the usefulness is the data. You ask Frank Spinelli from Microsoft, then you got it. That will be his answer. To me, it's debatable. As I said at the beginning, this can allow for sharing bandwidth and load between radio units on a common network fiber system. So if we were really in this picture here, maybe it's useful there. I haven't seen any studies that strongly proves that it is useful, but it may be useful because of this statistical multiplexing. So this is still to be proven in large-scale deployments. It's something maybe in slightly we could study to a certain extent, but we would need enough labs to actually have these ORAN radio units to do that. And the network really has to be dimensioned for a full load anyways, otherwise the service can suffer. So if you're dimensioning for full load, it doesn't really matter. The gains that you're going to get are minimal. Another place where it could make a difference is that the frequency domain processing allows for compression of different volume better than a time domain signal. You can pack actually more radio bandwidth into a 10, 20, 40, 100 gigabit link instead of using multiple links. That's a strong argument from my perspective. You always want to get as most out of the technology at trend N as you can. You can get twice as much out of it because you're doing compression. That's not a bad thing. But there is a significant increase in protocol complexity compared to a simple time domain protocol like the USRPs code. Much more complicated. So this is just to illustrate the functional splits. It's only one slide very quickly. This is the transmitter of an OFDM system. Anybody that studied this. Basically, at one point in the stack, you have the actual raw data, modulated data that you have to map to your OFDM symbols. That gets put into the spectrum with lots of empty subcarrier. It goes through a Fourier transform. You add samples at the end that are known as a cyclic prefix, and you send that out. UHD in the USRP and anything that uses a split 8 protocol is on the right-hand side. The radio data that gets packetized and sent across the network is coming out on the right-hand side. The ORAN solution is what's on the left-hand side. And in fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Each one of those colors that you see in the frequency domain go into its own PDU on the frontal interface. So the protocol is really about mapping the input of the OFDM modulator to an Ethernet network. And that's quite complex. So from the perspective of frontal for a 5G system, let's look at the most simplest case that some of you in the room are already very familiar with. Okay. The USRP, you have a radio application. It could be open air interface. It could be SRS, RAN, whatever. It could be a MISR, for that matter, which with UHD. So you have some software radio application on the right-hand side. That radio application actually has two interfaces. UHD has a control interface and it has a user interface. The control interface, you'll see in a second, is there to actually control the radio. The user interface is to stream the radio signals across the Ethernet, in this case, an IP network, if it's a network USRP. And UHD is the glue software that interfaces the radio application with the actual hardware of the user. So it implements this frontal protocol. So how do we actually do this in open air interface? That piece of software is really just a wrapper for UHD. So the control protocol of UHD, what is it used for? It's to set the frequencies, to set the gains, write data to the transmit or receive data from the receiver. That's really what goes across the frontal in UHD. Right, so the control interface specifically is the carrier frequencies, the gains, the sampling frequencies, any RF impairment corrections, the actual format that you use on the frontal, if it's floating point, if it's integer 16-bit, when to start the screening, when to stop the screening. That's what we mean by the control interface. The user plane interface are what UHD calls the screeners, the PX and RX screeners. These are timestamp packet transfers. So, but if you look under the hood in UHD, you have to look very far. These are wrapped, sent to, and received from socket interface, whether it's for USB or for IP-based contact. And they're multi-threaded also under the hood. And they can use libUSB for USB 3. They can use Linux, normal Linux UDP sockets, or in UHD, it can use UDPK, although we've never made that work. And ultimately, UHD uses jumbo frames for Ethernet. So that's the user plane of the thing. Now, this is a very example. This is an example in open air arrays. We have an API that is set frequency. And if you look what it does, it goes and grabs the information from the OAI data structures, changes them a little bit, and sends them to the SOP using an API that's defined inside of UHD, where set the transmit frequency, set the receive frequency. So this is all very trivial stuff, but you have to worry about the control interface. Streaming is a little bit more interesting. And basically what happens is you say on the receive direction, give me a certain number of samples and put them in this bucket. A very high level command inside of UHD. Under the hood, there are very many things that happen. And basically this command, the RX stream receive, it blocks and it returns samples and a timestamp when samples are available. So basically you call this routine, it goes to sleep. The thread that's calling it goes to sleep. The thread gets woken up when the samples are in the bucket. Basically what happens. And you get a timestamp saying these samples occurred at this time. Now that timestamp is very important because it's used to derive basic frame timing information. And it is one very big difference with respect to something like ORAN. ORAN does not work like that. Now, our time is in that very quickly again. But this timing information that you get from UHD, it allows you to say this piece of signal, it occurred in this frame and slot. Therefore, you can translate that timestamp into system time and ultimate system time. And it can actually be used as the basic timing of the radio application itself. And that's typically what happens. I think if you were to look inside of SOS RAN, it would be very similar in that respect. Marisoft too, in fact, it is quite similar. Now, the main application thread, you basically call the receive screen, you get an appropriate size, like one slot or 500 microseconds of signal. When it returns, you save the timestamp, say for slot N. You tell the receiver to start processing slot N, and the transmitter to start processing something in the future at N plus K. And the resulting transmit signal uses the TX streamer with the appropriate timestamp, and you just send the transmit buffer at the time relative to what you receive. So you can see every time you receive, you resynchronize or you keep in sync with the hardware. It's basically provides a real-time handshaking so that you can handle it as a bit. And UHD, one of the nice things that it completely hides the underlying socket mechanisms under the RxTX stream API. The advantage is that it's a very simple API. It's not very complicated to understand what's going on. But there is a disadvantage. If you're really looking for performance, you don't really know what's happening under the hood. So how many threads are being created by UHD? You don't know. You can find out. It's hard. You can find out. You don't know how the CPU and operating system optimizations are done. It's all hidden. And it actually uses libraries like Boost. You don't understand how that works either. So it's very nice to have a simple API, but ultimately, if you're looking for performance, say on 100 gigabit Ethernet link, very hard to understand how to optimize it. So you invariably have to go onto the mailing list with the people at National Instruments and say, this doesn't work. What do I need to do? Okay. So that is incident. Now, what about EC3? And here I'll take an example of AWS. The control plane is a partial ETSI-ORI implementation. Okay? Maybe nobody here has heard about ETSI-ORI. I'll show you in a second the document. What they've done, ETSI-ORI was an initiative for developing an open fronthaul inside of ETSI. It was defined for 4G, for LTE in 2014, or the last version of it. What AW2S did is they extended it a little bit to 5G. Strictly speaking, it was already for 4G, but they extended it to 5G. Now, the picture that I showed before with UHD is almost the same picture. You have the radio application. It has a control interface and a user interface. But those are split into two boxes. The control interface goes to a shared library called libORI, which implements the necessary protocols to dialogue with the radio unit. That's a piece of closed source software. When you buy the radio unit, they give you the library and the aspect of it. And then the user plane can use normal Linux if you like, or it can even use the data that we never tried. Okay? And that connects to one of the two devices, Jaguar or Panther. Another interesting thing similar to your USRP is you have an SSH or even Telnet management interface between the radio application and the radio unit itself. So it goes around the fronthaul and you can manage the devices. This is the ETSI-ORI specification for anybody that's interested. I mean, for me, what's interesting is there's a lot of excitement now about ORAN, this and that. This stuff has been around for a long time already. Okay, and they're done by serious people. I mean, the gang behind the ETSI-ORI was normal you guys, similar to the CP. And what they did here is they defined control and management procedures to go along with CP. If you look back at what I said, C3 and also EC3, they say you use standard protocols for control and management. One of those is ETSI-ORI. It could very well be inside some Ericsson equipment or even Huawei equipment that they use this because it's specified. We did a good job of specifying it at ETSI. It took several years to do it. It's used. Now, in fact, AWS decided to do this too. And I'm not 100% certain, but maybe even Microsoft does this. I'll know more about that in a couple of months. This is very similar in spirit to ORAN, but under the ETSI hat. And they stopped it in 2014, basically. It did not continue towards 5G. Stopped it. And there is no specification of user plane transport. It basically defaults to C3, which is basically the cloud. So even though this part is open, the end-to-end thing is the cloud. So just out of interest, this is a similar thing to what I showed you with the UHD, but now in the language of ORI. So you see this data structure, TX parameters, TX NRTDD. Basically here I'm saying this is the configuration for a certain antenna port, the channel bandwidth, ARFCN is the frequency in 3GPP speak, and the power. Okay, and then there's an API object creation, and these are specified by ORI, which sends these parameters to the radio unit, and the radio unit says okay or not okay. It's not that different from UHD. And if you look at OAI, this AW, sorry, there's an S missing there, AW2S ORI. Oh, no, sorry, it's there, AW2S ORI. You can see this interface. It's actually a lot simpler. You know, UHD it evolved over time. Many projects use it. They added many functions for different aspects. It's quite heavy today. This is very light. In that sense, it's simpler. Now streaming with EC3, it's a piece of cake. Basically, open a regular UDP socket with the radio unit, provide information to the radio unit about the QNOB fronthaul networking, like IP address or MAC address, exactly. You turn on the RX and TX streaming, very similar to UHD via something called ORI object state modification on the desired receive and transmit channels to unlock. And then they start streaming, just like UHD. The only difference is that the radio will stream in the RX via the socket using a vendor-specific packet format. There you are to see the hopes of C3, EC3, even with AW2S, they use the vendor-specific format. But they do that for a reason, because they decided to mimic UHD timestamping. So it's actually the same as UHD. So if you look in the packet, I'll show you the example. It's a synchronous protocol exactly like UHD, where the radio unit is the synchronization source. So multiple radio units are synchronized by GPS. They don't have UPP, but that's like a USRP. You know, if you take an M310, you can synchronize them by GPS too. And the GNOB actually doesn't need UPP, which is the case in ORAN. And so, in all intents and purposes, it's EC3 is really UDP like UHD. It's much more streamlined. But you have to work on a lower level. So you basically use a standard receive to grab each packet. Inside the packet, you have to parse it yourself. There are transport headers, which you can ignore. So the Ethernet and the UDP headers, you can ignore them. There's the EC3 header that you have to parse. There's an application header, which contains the timestamp, just like the USB timestamp, the antenna port, and 256 32-bit IQ samples. So 16-bit I and 16-bit Q, and there's no compression. So virtually the same as the standard M16 format of UHD. For your interest, I've taken here, you can look at this afterwards. These are the different packet formats. It's not very interesting. More interesting to see what you have to do in the code. So this is a piece where you generate the UHD. I showed you the receive, the EC3 I'm showing you the transmit. Basically, you can see what I put here in boldface are the elements of the EC3 protocol headers that you have to fill. So basically, you have a packet at the top called buff2, and little by little, you have to fill it in. So you put the revision of EC3, you put 64 in the message type. That means vendor specific. With ORAN, it's different. You have different packet types. The sequence ID contains timing information. So AW2S puts the timestamp in that sequence ID, and the PC ID contains the antenna port. Very simple. And the rest of the packet is just the data. And to send the packet to the radio unit, you use a standard UDP socket. Can't be simpler than that. ORAN is not like, it's quite simple. And you can all see this code if you like. So if I look at some notes here on what I would call non-ORAN EC3 no alive, non-ORAN because we implemented this. ORAN we're using in the second library. A simple implementation of a limited set of EC3 PDUs for this AW2F data unit. We really only use one vendor specific format for this data unit. What that means, if you were to take another radio unit that used EC3, for instance, you bought a Foxconn EC3 radio unit, they do exist. You would have to get documentation from Foxconn to understand how they did the protocol. You see if it's different in this or not. That's where it's different than using UHD or USRP. USRP, you have everything open that's coming from the instruments. When you buy a vendor-specific radio unit and you use EC3, you have to adjust the software. But one nice thing is that you can very properly make use of basic Linux sockets. Don't need to be for this. You could use it if you wanted, but you don't need it. You basically have one receive thread and one transmit thread. So that means 2 cores, 1 core for each thread. And the receive thread is basically constantly listening to a socket with a receive from. The Linux kernel, it turns out, is quite efficient in the end, at least the most recent versions of the kernel. A single 3 gigahertz Xeon core is sufficient for 4 antennas, even at 6144 megasamples per second. So basically, that means a 4x4, 50 megahertz, 5%. It's possible in one port. I don't think you would only one port. One transmit thread also with a queue-based message triggering send queue. So basically, the radio application fills a queue with signal events, and this transmit thread enters the queue and sends it across the socket. So basically, two CPU cores per socket is enough for a 4 antenna radio unit, and very likely less than what's used by you. Certainly less than you. So let's quickly go over the differences now with ORAN. We're just getting into the game here with ORAN. Now, the ORAN open fronthaul interface is quite a bit more complex than what I just showed you with ECP. Okay? It uses ECP heavily. But one thing to their credit, at least when it comes to the fronthaul interface of ORAN, the software version is fully open source and distributed by the ORAN software. That's a bit revolutionary in my opinion. It's an Intel implementation, good implementation, hard to understand, but it's a good implementation, high performance implementation, and it's fully open. So I think from a learning perspective, it's actually good. So that's really to the credit of the ORAN people. The other protocols are not really open. This one. Now the downside, of course, it's Intel implementation. It's really optimized for Intel-based x86 64. Look at some of the details. It will not run as intended today on AMD. Because the current AMD servers do not have an AVX512 unit, and the fronthaul implementation of Intel, of course, uses AVX512. That actually also means we tend to have a server that has AVX512. It will degrade, but it might not work. And I'm pretty sure it won't. Still uses EC3 as transport, but the application packets are much more complex. The control and user plane, they use the EC3 protocol, not just the user plane. And if you recall, the control for the AW2S EC3, it made use of ORI for the control. This one makes use of ORI for the control. Now, here I've listed the main differences. The first one is that there's a management protocol that's based on the Knopp and Yang data models. It's strictly speaking required for compliant ORU. The first versions of the ORU that we received, they didn't have it implemented. The first real one that we received did have it implemented, and you cannot use the thing without implementing, without stimulating the management engine. That's quite different from the other stuff, not just the necessary. Another difference with respect to AW2S and with respect to UHD, they use raw Ethernet on most of the ORUs that we saw. At least the ones that we have now, they're all use raw Ethernet. Strictly speaking, ORAN can use UDP, but it do not. Also, it tends to use VLAN tags, which is a bit of a mess. So the different streams have different tags, which means your switches have to know how to handle the tags. So that was took us some time to figure out. The other thing is on the side of the Genode B, you need to use what's known as SRIOV, which gives you virtualized interfaces. It's typically used in NFV scenarios when you want to have virtual interfaces in a cluster-based infrastructure. But here it's used on the front end. So you have a tag for the management, you have a tag for the control, and a tag for the unit. The HCP is also required on compliant ORAN only. So you need a DHCP server that's set up for the radio unit. PTP is also required, and a network card that has inside the Genode B needs so-called PTP hardware time sampling support. So you have to be careful with the cards you actually use. All of this is a little bit hidden. If you read carefully the documentation, you'll find it, but it's not just plug and play. And you also need to intervene higher in the radio access network layer 1 protocol. You have to integrate at the level of the physical channels. So you have different ORAN interfaces for different physical channels. That's more complicated than just sending a sample back and forth. I'll tell you a bar chart case very quickly. But basically, you have to send non-zero transmit physical research blocks sent according to the ORAN protocol. You have to receive non-zero physical research blocks for the uplink share channel, for the uplink control channel, for the sounding reference signal. And these are requested from the radio unit along with the special PRAT protocol units because these are different OFDM. You have to think very differently. It's not just the level of the samples anymore. It's really tailored to the 5G system and to a certain extent to the 4G system. The control plane packets, they contain configuration information for the transmitted and requested PDUs. Anybody that's looked at the FAPI or NFAPI specification, which we actually also use in ORAN, very similar to that. On the control channel, you send down configuration information. So this is the more complicated picture. I showed the simplest picture, UHD, and then OW2S. This is the ORAN picture. So you have a radio unit. Let's say it's a Mavenir radio unit there on the right. You have an interface which comes from the ORAN software community, which requires UPPK underneath, and that's the so-called open frontal interface. That communicates with the radio unit over two different VLAN tags. VLAN 1, VLAN 2. One is for control, one is for data. On the other side, with the radio application, you have a control interface and a user interface, which is basically also a streamer, but a little bit different than a streamer. Okay, because everything originates on the radio application. So it's not like the radio unit necessarily gives you the signals all the time. You have to ask for them, and you get them, and you have to give them. So basically what that means is all of this has to be synchronized by something. And I didn't show that in the picture, but there is also a PTP grandmaster that's connected to the radio unit and connected to the radio application. Okay, so the synchronization doesn't come from the radio unit itself. It comes from the PTP source in your network. The other things that you need in this picture are basically a DHCP server that the radio unit can get its IP address at the very beginning, because it does need an IP address for the management team. And you also need a netcom client that's running either inside the radio application or next to the radio application or somewhere on your network, managing everything. All possibilities are there. So, and you can see that netcom client has yet another VLAN connection with the radio unit, and that one actually uses SSH over TCP. This is a much more complicated picture, but this is basically, if anybody wanted to deploy an ORAN system in the lab, you're going to have to deal with that and set this up. So it's quite complex. So this is an example of the configuration of the machine at EURECOM. So here I did an IP link show on the machine which is running with UNIB. And you can see that on EM1, which is the physical link that is connected to the switch that has the radio unit on it, there are three virtual functions. So those are these SLIOV virtual functions with different MAC, with two have a MAC address 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. If you look in the ORAN documents, you'll see that is the default address for the UNIB. And we added another one, .77, which happens to be for the management panel. So you have, they're all on the same physical Ethernet, but there are two different MAC addresses that are shared on all Ethernet, and different than the physical MAC address. So this notion of the virtual interfaces is necessary for them. This is an example of a netconf get. So if anybody's used netconf, there's a tool in Linux called net2peer, which actually provides the libraries if you want to build a netconf client or server in your application. But they have a client command line interface for a client. So with this, we were playing around with the Mavenir radio unit. The first thing that you do with netconf after connecting to the device is you do a so-called get. And that does a good configuration of the device. This device, you can see this is the top of it. You can see this device is a Zilk RU. A little bit further down, you see the model name is Zilk ORU. Zilk is a Chinese company that actually builds the equipment for Navineer. We're debugging this, we have to talk to these particular groups. If you go further, you see all of the ORM configurations that the device supports, and this is the bandwidth and the power and whatever. But you can see it's an XML description. And so again, this is very different than working with the USRP. And so basically, this management plane is there to get the capabilities, to edit the configuration, change the state, just like in the two examples that I gave, start the streamer, stop the streamer, changing the state is start the streamer and stop the streamer from the perspective of the streamer. But it has to go through NetCom. And you can also very interestingly monitor events and faults. For instance, you can set up a lot of people here probably use these tools over Flexgram before and now Flexrig to get statistics from the phenotype. You can actually use the management plane for that in a real device. The idea is not to do that over the EP interface, but to do it over the management. This is an example of Wireshark trace of an ORM that we can't talk about. So this was not Navineer, this is from a Foxconn ORU that we have at EURECOM. We're doing interoperability testing with a few of these in parallel. Maybe it's hard for everybody to see, but you can look at it afterwards. What you see here in Wireshark, and what's very nice is the ORM software community also made the hooks for Wireshark. The debugging is very nice. You can see Mellanox is the DU or the B. The Chongqing is the I guess it's the FPGA that's inside the radio unit, or the Ethernet device inside the FPGA. You can see the distinction between C plane and U plane. Okay, and if you go and dissect the packets, you can see ORAN evolved a common public radio interface, ORAN frontal CU, and then this was malformed packet, but but basically you can see the Wireshark, the complete dissection of the protocol. So I mean, this picture actually says a lot with respect to the difference of what a lot of people are using, like USRPs. You don't usually need Wireshark to inspect the USB. Some people do that, but you don't need to. Something like ORAN, and to a lesser extent, just normal EC2, these have now become networking devices. This thing even has NetCom on top. It's not that different from a Cisco device, but for radio. And that shows the evolution of these things. And that's in my opinion, one of the big outcomes of something like ORAN is that evolution. Okay, so if I conclude here, I hope I didn't go too much over time. I provided an overview of current frontal interfaces and their integration in the OAI code base. We looked a little bit at UHD and how from UHD you can evolve to something like UC-Secret. And then finally, how you can evolve to the state-of-the-art ORAN in frontal protocol. I think that experimental networks like slices RI and the evolutions of power, at one point, we will go beyond UHD in the experimental community. Everybody will still be using USRPs in their lab. Don't get me wrong. It's the basic device. But to do certain types of experimentation, we're going to have to start playing around with some of these devices in some deployment scenarios. If you want to test what I was saying about statistical multiplexing of radio units, and you maybe in slices, maybe we could have 50 of these things deployed in the network. I don't know. There maybe we can study this in the You're not going to do that with UHD. And basically what that means is we're going to have to start looking at more complicated networking scenarios. But that's also interesting too. The radio people are going to have to start looking at what the switching people are. I mean, tomorrow you'll hear Damian talk about state-of-the-art switching. Same kind of thing. There are new tools that have to be learned. For the deployment scenarios that we will look at, that's going to be necessary. And actually, I think that even USRPs, I'm pretty sure that USRPs will also start to support open frontal reception. The fact that it is open is something that's interesting for companies like National Instruments. They want to be able to take their X410 device, which, as I said, is not that different internally from the Navigator radio unit. And there are discussions now about you know, replacing UHB with the open fronthaul interface in Intel with an X410. And then they need something on the other side. They could use a key-site tester. That's what the ORAN people in operators labs are doing today. They're taking a Navigator radar unit and they're using a key-site tester on the other side. But they could also take tools like a field. And that's what we're trying to start to do with some of our operator things. Say, okay, you can take this and you know with today with a Navigator ORU, but maybe tomorrow with an X410. And so the discussions are also happening with some of partners like National Instruments to make that happen. And some of their industry partners are trying to force them to make that happen. And so I do think within the next year or so you will see them. It might be expensive, but okay, so that's the end of my very long content discussion.
Thank you, Raymond, for the presentation. Are there any questions on site participants? Any questions?
Okay, we can do this on the Slack afterwards, and then this is a lot to digest.
Yes, thank you, Raymond.